And so what Dr. Garneau and I will do in the next few minutes is we'll draw from various fields, history and sociology and education and psychology, and give you some perspective and propose perhaps redefining the polymath for contemporary society. And we'll begin with three questions. First of all, can we redefine the polymath? And if we can, how would it be? What is the polymath in contemporary society? And finally, where do we find this person or these principles of our redefined polymath?
Okay. So if we're trying to locate the polymath in search of a new definition, one of the things that we should look at, or one of the places that we should look, are the contextual or historical contexts in which the polymath easily fit into. So what I want to do is just kind of roll back a little bit and find the essence of the polymath, which is more commonly found in rural communities prior to the Industrial Revolution. So if we start looking at rural life, especially before the Industrial Revolution, what we find is that we have high levels of homogeneity, meaning that people essentially had about the same life. So when we look at the impact of this, we see that in this leveled culture, having a breadth of skills, in other words, a wide range of skills, was highly conducive to survival in this in this time period. So if we want to be able to extrapolate that to the polymath, we see that people living at this time had a large range of skills. Even if it weren't for a lot of depth, it was still for a lot of breadth. This breadth of knowledge in general for the populace can in some ways be extrapolated to the ideas of the polymath. So what we find happening with the Industrial Revolution is a change in this general orientation of individuals. So with the Industrial Revolution, we see large numbers of population moving from rural areas to urban areas. The consequence of this is people that used to have shared culture living next to each other are now living next to people who might be very different from one another, who are bringing different talents, who have a diversity and a different range of skill sets. And because the populations have increased at such large numbers in the Industrial Revolution, in the mid-1800s in Europe, and then anywhere from 50 to 80 years later, all the way to the United States, we find that a division of labor is probably a more efficient way for larger, more bureaucratic societies to operate.
Another interesting feature that comes out of this period is the vast fields of knowledge and research, and these were emerging and blossoming. And so you would have the field of science, for example, and this is just one rendering of a graphic, the way it can be broken down. But the field of science, the broad field, becomes broken down into these other fields. The Polymath Institute, and there actually is something called the Polymathic Institute, has a really interesting definition that we can learn a lot from, but I think we can extend. It describes the polymath as a person of great or varied learning, and suggests that a polymath, rather than mastering a subject and then searching for a new problem or question in that field, finds an interesting question and then acquires the knowledge and skills required to answer it without regard to subject boundaries. So in the end, our polymath seeks to obtain a skill set that is universally relevant in a variety of disciplines, vocations, and endeavors. And you all know that people change careers a lot these days, but the skill set can be used in a variety of academic or work settings. Our polymath may not make significant discoveries or contributions in a field, but they will have the skill set that allows them to do a lot of things, to evaluate, to analyze, to apply, to create, to formulate effective questions as a starting point, to integrate fields of knowledge, to consider and analyze bodies of knowledge, to use appropriate technologies and information systems for accessing knowledge, to synthesize ideas and information, to use critical thinking skills in arriving at potential answers, and finally to apply knowledge. This sounds alarmingly similar to what we seek to do at this institution.
Creativity has been a topic that's been very, very big in psychology for many, many years. It's gotten even bigger recently due to the technology we have in neuroscience, where we can take brain scans through fMRI studies, do non-invasive research. We don't have to pop open your head and actually look at your brain. But prior to this, a lot of the information we got in neuroscience was due to people who suffered from severe brain injury. We would look at what happened to them afterwards, what capabilities they had before and what capabilities they had afterwards. And we were able to see what areas of the brain were damaged and how they correspond to those particular lost functions. So one of the first neuroscience patients where we started discovering individual functions of the brain was a man named Phineas Gage. Here's a picture of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage lived in the 1840s, so the mid-19th century. Phineas was a railroad construction crew foreman. So it was his job to kind of supervise a construction crew, but he had a very special job on this construction crew. If you look at what he's holding in his hands, it's a metal rod. It's about 3 feet 7 inches in length, weighs about 13¼ pounds. So it's a sizable rod. What he would do with this rod is he would take the rod and he would tamp explosive powder into holes that had been drilled into rock so they could loosen the rock and hence build the railroad. Well, one day, actually, September 13th, 1848, whilst poor Phineas Gage is working on the railroad, he's tamping down the dynamite, and all of a sudden it detonates. Kaboom! Well, that rod, again, 3 feet 7 inches, 13¼ pounds, does this to poor Phineas Gage. Now, keep in mind, this is 1848. It goes through his left cheek, right behind his eye, and all 3 feet 7 inches, 13¼ pounds, did I mention? Out through the top of his head. Well, it takes with it part of his brain. And the interesting thing is he survives. Out in the middle of nowhere, some country doctor patches him up, and he lives. He lives for about another 11 years afterwards. But Phineas Gage has changed. Prior to the accident, he's a very industrious person, considered a rather shrewd businessman, made plans for the future, good abstract thought process. After this accident, though, after that prefrontal lobe disappears, or is shot out through his head, rather, he becomes quite surly. He's unable to focus his attention, cursed profusely, and lost his ability for abstract thinking. So he completely changes, all because this little area of his brain gets blown out. Now let me show you where that is on this map. Okay, whoops. Sorry if I shine this in somebody's eye. Okay, the area is right in here. It's part of the frontal lobe. And let me go through just a little description of this part of the brain. What we're looking at now is what we call the cerebral cortex. So cortex is basically just the word for bark. So we're talking about the outer coating of the brain. And this is where a lot of our higher functioning takes place. So we've got 4 major lobes. We've got the parietal lobe over here. Oops, sorry. That's the parietal lobe. That's associated with somatosensory information. So we're taking in information about touch, temperature of the room is processed there. Some visual information is processed. The next one's the temporal lobe down here. That's where a lot of our auditory information takes place. Also down at the very bottom of the temporal lobe, that's where we process faces. So when you're looking at a face, that area of your brain is lighting up. And then the back part right here, this is the occipital lobe. So this is where all of our sensory information is being processed. We're taking that in, it goes to this area of the brain and is processed. The frontal lobe, though, takes that processed information and starts messing around with it. And this is where we have, this is where our higher order thinking takes place. So, and this is the area of Gage's brain that is gone. So what takes place in the frontal lobe? Well, this is where we take in that sensory information, and one of the first things we do is we come up with a concept of ourselves. I'm an individual, I have a body, I'm James. Or you. Self-reflective consciousness. We can sit there and we can think about our actions. Abstract thinking. So a key component to creativity, to being a polymath, is that abstract thinking ability. Cognitive flexibility. Taking in information, manipulating the information, coming up with something new. Theory of mind. That aspect of consciousness where I think I'm thinking about what you're thinking right now. I'm able to take your perspective. And also, two other areas, two main features: working memory, where I'm taking in new information, combining it with older information, and manipulating it. So I'm, in a sense, creating something. This is what's happening in the working memory. Also, sustained and directed attention, the ability to focus on the task at hand. Now, Phineas Gage gave us a good insight to this, because when this part of his brain was destroyed, all of these abilities were gone. He was unable to do this anymore. And I got thinking about this as I was looking through this, and I got looking at that definition of a polymath, and I thought, you know what? Every one of us has the hardware to be a polymath. It's already structured in our heads. And I got thinking where I'm at. Well, I'm at a nice liberal arts university. It's like, I'm at a polymath nursery, you know? And so I got thinking to my students, you know, you've got all you need in your heads right now to be a polymath. You're at an institution that supports that, so you'll be a polymath.
I first became interested in Hildegard von Bingen as a graduate student in an early music class. This was the first experience I had when I was able to hear some of her music. It was a liturgical drama called Play of the Virtues. And the fact that this woman, Hildegard, was a visionary, a naturalist, a playwright, a poetess, and composer, it intrigued me, and I really wanted to learn more about her. Born in the 11th century in Bermersheim, Germany, Hildegard was the 10th child of noble parents. So as being the 10th child, she was actually given as a tithe to the church. When she was 8, she was given to the convent at Disi-Bodenberg. And later, in one of her visions, she was directed to found a convent in Rupertsberg, near Bingen, Germany. This is a drawing from the 19th century, and this abbey was actually destroyed in the 30 Years' War, but this was the building as it was during her time in Germany. Eventually, Hildegard became abbess of the monastery, and at the age of 42, she wrote, "Heaven was opened, and a fiery light of exceeding brilliance came and permeated my whole brain and inflamed my whole heart." Hildegard documented her visions and her prophecies in text and illuminations or illustrations in a book called Sciavis, that was short for Sciavis Vios Domini, which means know the ways of the Lord. This was a work of instruction and direction to achieve salvation. So here we see one of these drawings, these illuminations from Sciavis. It's called Hildegard's Awakening. You can see the flames or the representation of the Holy Ghost, the visions coming to her, and she's actually dictating to her scribe here that is in front of her. With astounding creativity, Hildegard wrote 2 books on natural history and medicine, a morality play, and literary works. She was a prolific composer of sacred music, primarily for the 8 canonical hours of the divine office.
Hildegard was made a saint and then a doctor of the church in 2012. The path for sainthood was a long one for her, and her visions troubled her, and she was unsure whether they were a gift from God, and she was really afraid to share them. She sought the higher counsel in the church through a man named Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He encouraged her to continue to record her visions. And in 1147, Pope Eugene III read one of Hildegard's texts after, and afterwards, he actually authorized her to go ahead and to write down her visions and to continue to speak openly about them because he felt that they were actually a gift from the Holy Spirit. Her visions had theological content such as creation and the fall of man, the covenant between Christ and the church, and the bond between priesthood and the Holy Eucharist. In the 13th and 14th century, there were a bunch of popes, obviously, and so they kind of come in concessions. Gregory the Ninth, Innocent the Fourth, Clement the Fifth, and John the 22nd all ordered what was called the process of information. And essentially that is the gathering of substantiating information about the miracles that were accredited and attributed to her intercession. And she was never canonized. However, she did reach the level of beatification, which is one of the steps on the many-step process to becoming a saint. John Paul II and Benedict XVI actually both called her a saint, and Benedict XVI did what was called an equivocal or equivalent canonization on May 10th, and then bestowed on her the highest rank of Doctor of the Church on October 7th in 2012. And the reason why he did this is he felt that she was deserving of this because of the perennially relevant and authentic teacher of theology, and she was a profound scholar of natural history and music. The people of Germany actually honored her on her 900th birthday by creating a 10 Deutschmark in her honor. And she really has had a resurgence in the past. She actually is popular among the feminist movement. She wanted equal rights for men and women in sexuality, emphasizing a woman's pleasure. She also thought that men and women were created equal. And I thought this was quite amazing. She actually was credited with writing about the first description of the first female orgasm in the Western world, and this is what she actually says about that. When a woman is making love with a man, a sense of heat in her brain, which brings with it sensual delight, communicates the taste of that delight during the act and summons forth the emission of the man's seed. And when the seed has fallen into its place, the vehement heat descending from her brain draws the seed to itself and holds it. And soon the woman's sexual organs contract, and all the parts that are ready to open up during the time of menstruation now close, in the same way as a strong man's hand can hold something enclosed in his fist.
I wonder if an actress has ever blossomed into a mathematician or scientist. Well, I'm sure that some of these people are going to be familiar to you. So there is Mayim Bialik, who is, of course, from Blossom, and then most recently from The Big Bang Theory. There's Danica McKellar, who is Winnie Cooper in The Wonder Years. So I assume that you've made the connection of blossomed into a mathematician or wondered about. Okay, also, how about Natalie Portman of Star Wars, Thor, and the Black Swan? Or, I'm pretty sure none who were around at this time, but in the 1930s and 40s, there was actress Hedy Lamarr, who was once dubbed the most beautiful woman in the world. Okay, should they be considered polymaths? There's Mayim Bialik. Her heritage, she was the daughter of a first-generation American teacher and a filmmaker. Her grandparents were European refugees from the Holocaust. She started acting at age 12, and she was cast as Blossom at 15. She did go on to college, however, she thought that education was important, and so even though she was doing Blossom, she was accepted into Harvard, but they gave her a deferred placement. And while she was still working on Blossom, waiting for it to finish so she could go on to Harvard, she was accepted by Yale. And so she decided to go to UCLA. In 2007, she earned a PhD in neuroscience, specializing in psychoneuroendocrinology. And I'm not going to read that thesis. All right, but she had some other talents as well. Besides acting, she was an accomplished dancer. She played the piano, the trumpet, the bass guitar, and the harp. Okay. She was also is spokesman for the Holistic Moms Network. She writes weekly for the Kevlar.com, which is a parenting site, and it's actually a rather hip, sometimes comical, irreverent parenting site that includes a newish Jewish twist on parenting issues, but it's not exclusively for Jewish mothers. She's also an author of a book, Beyond the Sling, a real-life guide to raising confident, loving children, the attachment parenting way. Okay, then there's Natalie Portman, who was actually born Natalie Hirschlag. Independent study in sophomore. So we have independent study here. Well, they had independent study in her high school. And she did a simple method to demonstrate the enzymatic production of hydrogen from sugar, illustrating environmentally friendly biotechnology for the utilization of renewable energy sources. And that earned her a semifinalist position that year in the prestigious Intel Science Talent Search. And this is as a sophomore in high school. In a recent New York Times Magazine article, Why Are There Still So Few Women in Science? The author wrote, Danica McKellar, who starred as Winnie Cooper on The Wonder Years before earning her bachelor's degree in math at UCLA, along with her follow-up books, Kiss My Math, Hot X Algebra Exposed, and Girls Get Curves, Geometry Takes Shape, may well have done more to encourage girls to stick with math than any other governmental task force. I think that's quite the compliment. And then to our final woman, Hedy Lamarr. Okay, she was born in Vienna in 1919. She was christened Hedwig Eva Marie Geisler. She was the daughter of an affluent Jewish banker. She attended exclusive girls' school in Switzerland. She studied ballet and classical piano. She spoke at least 5 languages. Okay, so Richard Rhodes, who's best known for his Pulitzer Prize-winning work on the atomic bomb, also wrote a book on Hedy Lamarr. Makes sense, right? Atomic bomb, Hedy Lamarr. Okay. And it was called Hedy's Folly, The Life and Breakthrough Inventions of Hedy Lamarr, the Most Beautiful Woman in the World. And this is how he described her. The glamorous movie star by day was by night the lonely immigrant channeling an inner Thomas Edison. She set aside one room in her home, had a drafting table installed with the proper lighting and the proper tools, had a whole wall in the room of engineering reference books.
Present, I met and spoke with members of our esteemed faculty across 4 disciplines, so Blake Morgan in Fine Arts, Chris Martin in Economics, David Zodaway in Science, and Zach Simpson in Philosophy and Religious Studies. So I started off by asking him what he believes it takes to be a successful artist. And what he said was to be fascinated by it and to be able to work very hard at it. And I easily identified with this because you hear something very, very similar from mathematicians all the time. But we discussed how that might be necessary for success. It perhaps wasn't sufficient. So in other words, there are lots of aspiring artists who work very hard and have lots of drive that end up not making it professionally. And Blake responded by saying, even if someone is not going to be a professional painter, if they approach it with interest and fascination, I think it will give them a meaningful way to engage the world. I think that's really important. So you can see some of the tie-ins already to this concept of polymathy. And so he continued to say, here's the fun thing about teaching. If you go about it right, you can get just about everybody interested. You can get all of your students interested. What's fun about teaching, what's fun about learning this stuff is discovering it for yourself. So I initiated the conversation with Chris by asking about how he views economics in the broad spectrum of the liberal arts. I asked these questions to everybody in varying order to somewhat informally get the conversation going. And so he paused contemplatively for about 10 seconds. And he just kind of, as if he was crafting the perfect response in his head. And so he responded by saying the place of economics in the liberal arts is studying the implications of scarcity and self-interest for social behavior. Along the same lines, he later continued, economics is a system of thought about inductions from human nature. I was interested to talk to David because even though mathematicians are usually classified as scientists, I don't really consider myself a scientist because, frankly, I just don't know all that much about chemistry or biology. So I started by asking David what he thought it took to be a successful scientist, and he said probably the one thing it takes to be successful is passion. You have to be passionate about learning. The final faculty member that I talked to was Dr. Zach Simpson, and I didn't really know what to expect from Zach because, first, my knowledge of philosophy does not extend far beyond basically listing name or famous philosophers. I've observed Dr. Simpson on many occasions competently engaging in conversations involving a broad spectrum of topics, political science, mathematics, religion, biology. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised he is a professor of interdisciplinary studies. And so I didn't exactly know what kind of response I would get. So I'm going to give you the basic idea of my conversation with Zach. He said, "I have a conception of philosophy as the criticism of concepts, the skill of understanding how different systems of thought operate independently of one another and how they interact. I like to show my students how systems of thought change over time. I want them to see the positive side of change, but also the negative side that comes along with that. Every system of thought operates in this way."
Tonight, that Alice in Wonderland is perhaps the best tangible representation of the abilities of polymaths. It combines imaginative storytelling, literary devices, and logical and mathematical puzzles. Two great polymaths connected with this work are Lewis Carroll and Raymond Smullyan. In The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, Carroll uses math to enhance scenarios that a young girl experiences in dreams, whereas Smullyan uses literary narration to bring math and logic puzzles to life in his work Alice in Puzzleland.
Logic is considered to be one of the most basic concepts in math, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is awash with it. An excellent example of this is in the chapter A Mad Tea Party. Alice states that "I mean what I say" has the same meaning as "I say what I mean." But when you really consider these statements, you can see that they're very different. The Hatter replies to Alice, "Well, you might as well just say 'I see what I eat' is the same thing as 'I eat what I see.'" In this case, the Hatter is right. Carroll is demonstrating here that the converse of a preposition is not always the same as the preposition.
One such person who was inspired by Carroll's ability to blend math and literature is best-selling author and mathematician Raymond Smullyan. Smullyan was born in New York in 1919 and has worked in many different fields throughout his life. His first passion was music. Smullyan performed as a concert pianist throughout his adolescent years and went on to teach piano at Roosevelt College in Chicago. Unfortunately, this career was short-lived due to tendinitis in his right arm. From there, Smullyan studied math and logic, received his PhD in math from Princeton in 1959, and eventually he was able to teach mathematical logic at both Princeton and Dartmouth. His interests have also extended into professional magic, not to mention his philosophical writings on Chinese Taoism. Some of Smullyan's mathematical works include the theory of formal systems and first-order logic. In 1978, Smullyan had published his first book of riddles, What is the Name of This Book?, which consisted of knights and knaves riddles based on Count Dracula. Smullyan continued to demonstrate his abilities to combine literary narration with math and logic in books like The Chess Mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, The Lady or the Tiger, To Mock a Mockingbird, and of course in 1982, Alice in Puzzleland. Smullyan was intrigued by how Carroll had incorporated math and logic into his stories about Wonderland. It was very rare in both Smullyan's and Carroll's time for math and literature to be combined, especially in such a way as Carroll had blended them. Rather than simply analyze the math in Alice in Wonderland, Smullyan used this story as the basis for a series of his own related puzzles, which would then be combined into Alice in Puzzleland. Basing puzzles off of Carroll's Wonderland was ingenious, in that Carroll had already established a world filled with logical riddles and mathematical quirks. Smullyan simply expanded upon Carroll's characters and setting in order to create a scenario of young Alice solving problems to get through Wonderland and return home. The full title, Alice in Puzzleland, A Carolinian Tale for Children Under 80, exemplifies how the riddles are geared toward an informal audience, one that is seeking fun rather than enlightenment.
Pythagoras is, however, widely considered to be among the first of the polymaths. Now, unlike some of those other fine interdisciplinary thinkers that preceded him, Pythagoras was the beginning of a particular line of polymaths that would go on to shape Western culture as we understand it today, and that, in my estimation, is much better than merely being first. Pythagoras' teachings come to us mostly as hearsay, and they are without a doubt filtered through the beliefs and aspirations of those who followed in his footsteps. We cannot know what Pythagoras' message or his accomplishments may have really been with any more certainty than we can compare and contrast Jesus' original ministry with Paul's Hellenistic interpretation of the meaning of his crucifixion. But we can measure the importance and perhaps the novelty of Pythagoras' message by the deep impression that it left upon history. Now, for whatever confluence of reasons, Pythagoras brought his peculiar blend of Egyptian geometry, Babylonian astronomy, Greek logic, and kind of a homebrewed mysticism, and started a school in Croton. Now, of the fact that there was a school, there is very little doubt. What exactly was taught at this school is a matter of basically pure speculation, because the school, or Pythagoras and the school, had an absolute emphasis on the oral transmission of knowledge to the exclusion of all written texts, and of absolute secrecy regarding what that knowledge was. The order seemed to include hierarchies that were based on a series of revealed mysteries, which would also include components of practical study. So students could apply to the school, and in the outer order, known as the listeners, or akousmatikoi, they could expect to receive an education that we would be tempted to call pretty liberal artsy, with only maybe glimpses at the mysticism and deep speculation that was taking place among the inner order. But gifted students could then be recruited into the inner order of mathematikoi, or the learners. Now, these students, at least in the first generation, were those who were initiated into the deep mysteries of Pythagorean mysticism, and most likely taught by Pythagoras himself. So what did they believe? Well, Pythagoras believed, like Anaximander before him, that the foundation of reality had to lie within something that was beyond his senses. So unlike other Greek philosophers who tried to explain the meaning of fundamental ideas through the physical elements, so this by necessity would be talking about an observation with the senses, Pythagoras turned to reason and saw a world of abstractions that was laying the foundation for the possibilities of the material world. He believed that numbers were the language of that neighboring yet alien kingdom, and that all reality could be understood and predicted by their careful examination.